In 1928, a black cook named Cornelius Washington stood in a galley kitchen on the Illinois Central Line, 8 feet wide, 18 feet long. The temperature hit 125 degrees before dawn. He was preparing breakfast for 40 white passengers who would never learn his name. That breakfast is number 8 on this list. Number 5 was served on the Panama Limited and helped define Creole cooking for your grandparents' generation. Number 18 was a dessert so beloved that passengers wrote letters to the railroad asking for the recipe. These 25 meals were prepared by black hands in segregated kitchens on wheels. They fed a nation that would not let these cooks sit at its tables. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count down 25 forgotten Pullman porter meals black cooks served on America's railroads. Number 25, fried chicken with cream gravy. This was the dish that made passengers choose one railroad over another. A black cook in a Pullman galley could turn out 40 plates in a space smaller than your kitchen closet. He dredged each piece in seasoned flour, fried it in cast iron like his mother's kitchen had taught him, and served it golden and crackling with the gravy made from pan drippings, flour, and milk. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad built its entire reputation on this single dish. Passengers on the Royal Blue Line between Washington and New York requested it by name. The cook had no formal training, no culinary degree, no chef's title. He had something better. He had his mother's hands and the memory of a farmhouse kitchen in Virginia or Georgia where chicken was Sunday and Sunday was sacred. For the white passengers in the dining car, it was a fine meal on a train. For the black cook behind the curtain, it was proof that his grandmother's heritage could command a dining room, even if he could not sit in one. Number 24, blackberry cobbler. This was the dessert that arrived at your table still bubbling like a kettle left on the stove. A Pullman cook simmered blackberries with sugar in a shallow pan, then laid strips of pastry dough across the top and slid it into the oven. The berries darkened into a thick, sweet filling while the pastry turned golden and flaky. On the Southern Railway, cooks picked up fresh blackberries at station stops along the Appalachian route during summer months. The fruit cost the railroad nothing. The labor cost them almost nothing either. But the result was a cobbler that passengers remembered for decades. Black cooks carried their grandmother's cobbler recipes in their heads. Not written down, not measured. They adjusted sugar by taste. They knew dough was ready by feel. If you have ever eaten a cobbler that made you close your eyes and go quiet, you have tasted what these men carried on the rails. That silence at the table was their legacy. Number 23, Welsh rarebit. You would not expect this on a list of meals made by black cooks, but that is the point. Pullman cooks were trained to prepare European cuisine, French sauces, British pub fare, continental breakfast. Welsh rarebit was sharp cheddar sauce seasoned with mustard and Worcestershire, spooned over toast and finished under a broiler until the cheese blistered and browned. On the New York Central, this was a late-night supper for first-class passengers. The black cook had to understand how cheese behaves under heat, had to know a roux the way a baker knows yeast. He was expected to cook at the level of a fine hotel while earning a laborer's wages. The Pullman Company demanded perfection from its black workers. It did not offer respect in return. Welsh rarebit required skill, timing, and knowledge. The men who prepared your supper had all three. The menu carried no credit, not their name, not their face, not a word of thanks. Number 22, lima beans baked in mustard sauce. On the Illinois Central's Panama Limited, this side dish became a destination all by itself. A Pullman cook simmered dried lima beans until tender, folded them into a sauce of mustard, molasses, and vinegar, then baked everything low until the top crisped and the sauce thickened. The beans turned savory, sweet, and sharp all at once, like a conversation between 3 generations of Southern cooks. The recipe came from the black church supper table, adapted for a railroad dining car. The cook who brought it aboard watched his mother make it every Sunday after service. He knew the molasses had to balance the mustard, the vinegar had to cut the sweetness. Passengers on that Chicago to New Orleans run ordered it alongside fried catfish and cornbread. They never asked who made it. They did not have to. Your first bite told you everything about where that cook came from. Number 21, broiled Chesapeake crab cakes. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad served these on white china plates to passengers traveling between Baltimore and Chicago. Cook mixed fresh crab meat with breadcrumbs, egg, and seasoning, formed the cakes by hand, and broiled them until the tops turned golden. The crab came straight from the Chesapeake Bay, loaded at the Baltimore station. The cook handled it gently because his mother taught him that good crab meat does not need much. A little seasoning, a light binder, careful hands. That was it. That was the whole method. Black watermen on the Chesapeake had been catching and picking crabs for generations before any railroad put the dish on your plate. The cook in that galley kitchen continued a tradition older than the Pullman Company. He made those crab cakes the way his people had always made them. The railroad just gave him a different kitchen to work in, a smaller one on wheels at 60 miles an hour. Number 20, cream chipped beef on toast. Soldiers called it something your grandmother would not repeat at her table. Dried beef shaved thin, simmered in cream sauce, spooned over buttered toast. This was a standard Pullman breakfast from the 1890s through the 1950s. A black cook could prepare it in 7 minutes, which mattered when 40 breakfasts had to leave the kitchen in under an hour. The cream sauce was basic: butter, flour, milk, salt. But in skilled hands, it became richer than its ingredients suggested, like a plain hymn sung by someone who believed every word. On the Santa Fe line, cooks added cayenne. On the Southern Pacific, a spoonful of mustard. Each cook left his fingerprint on the dish, even though the company insisted every meal taste the same on every train. Black cooks found ways to sign their work without breaking rules. That took more than skill. That took artistry. Number 19, terrapin stew. This was the dish that separated Pullman dining from ordinary railroad food. Terrapin, a small freshwater turtle, was a luxury ingredient in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Black cooks on the eastern seaboard prepared it in a cream and sherry sauce with egg yolks stirred in at the last moment to thicken the broth. The meat was tender, rich, and unlike anything else you would find on the rails. On the Pennsylvania Railroad, terrapin appeared on first-class dinner alongside oysters and lobster. The cook had to clean and butcher the turtle, extract the meat without tearing it, build a sauce delicate enough to let the flavor come through. This was technical cooking at the highest level, performed by men the company classified as unskilled labor. By the 1940s, terrapin became scarce and the dish faded from menus. But for 50 years, black hands prepared one of America's most expensive dishes in a kitchen barely larger than a coat closet. The passengers who ate it never thought about that. The cooks who made it never forgot. Number 18, sweet potato souffle. This was the recipe passengers wrote letters about. On the Southern Railway, a black cook baked sweet potatoes until they collapsed, mashed them with butter, brown sugar, cinnamon, and vanilla, then folded in beaten egg whites and baked the mixture until it puffed golden and trembling like a Sunday morning sunrise over the Carolina Piedmont. It arrived at your table still rising. The first spoonful was like biting into a warm cloud. Sweet potatoes were cheap, eggs were cheap, but the technique required patience that most cooks could not replicate on solid ground, let alone on a swaying train. The cook whipped those egg whites by hand with a wire whisk in a kitchen where everything moved. He timed the baking so the souffle reached you before it fell. He did this while also preparing a full-course dinner for a full car of passengers who did not know his name. Nobody wrote letters praising the cook. They praised the souffle. The hands that made it stayed invisible. But every black cook on the southern line knew that recipe by heart. They passed it down the way their mother's mother passed down spirituals, not on paper, in whispers, from memory to memory, with pride that nobody could take from them. That souffle was not a recipe. It was an inheritance, rising and golden and fragile, carried on a train that crossed the same land where their grandparents had once worked without wages, without names, without the right to sit and eat what their own hands had made. Number 17, stewed chicken and dumplings. This was the meal black cooks carried from home kitchens onto the train. A whole chicken simmered until the meat fell from the bone. Then spoonfuls of biscuit dough dropped into the bubbling pot, covered and left to steam until the dumplings puffed soft and pillowy like small clouds floating in broth. On the Louisville and Nashville Railroad, this was a lunch staple. The cook made it the way his grandmother made it in her Alabama kitchen. The only difference was the motion of the floor beneath his feet. Passengers ate it with silver forks on white linen. The cook ate his portion, standing in the galley during a 10-minute break if he got one. Pullman cooks logged 400 hours a month. A regular work week totals 160. These men worked 2.5 times that, and still the dumplings came out soft. Still the broth came out clear. That was not just cooking. That was the discipline that built a union. Number 16, pan-fried catfish. Below the Mason-Dixon line, catfish was poor folks' food. In a Pullman dining car, it became something you would order at a fine restaurant. A black cook dredged fresh fillers in cornmeal with salt, pepper, and cayenne, then fried them in cast iron until the crust turned crisp and gold. The fish inside stayed moist and flaky like river water still ran through it. Served with lemon and coleslaw, it looked elegant. On the Illinois Central between New Orleans and Chicago, catfish appeared on the lunch menu regularly. The fish was loaded fresh at Mississippi stops. The cook handled it like someone who had caught catfish barehanded as a boy, pulling them from muddy creek banks on summer afternoons. He knew the grain, knew the moment to turn the fillet so the crust sealed without burning. That knowledge did not come from a Pullman training manual. It came from a river and a grandmother who said, "Turn it once and only once." Number 15, bread pudding with bourbon sauce. If you have ever tasted a bread pudding that stopped you mid-sentence, this is where that recipe started. Stale bread torn into pieces, soaked in custard of eggs, milk, sugar, and vanilla, baked until the top crisped and the center stayed soft and trembling. The bourbon sauce came last, warm and poured tableside like liquid amber. Brown sugar, butter, and bourbon whisked smooth. A black cook on a Louisville and Nashville line had this dessert in his bones. Bread pudding was the original waste-nothing recipe of the Black South. Stale bread was never thrown away. It was transformed. On the train, the cook used leftover dinner rolls from the previous night's service. He soaked them in custard and baked them while the dining car reset. Nothing wasted. Not the bread, not the time, not the knowledge that your grandmother's scraps could close a meal with more grace than any pastry chef's showpiece. Number 14, corned beef hash with poached eggs. This was the workhorse of Pullman breakfast. corned beef diced fine, mixed with potatoes and onion, pressed into a hot skillet until the bottom formed a dark crust like a layer of burnt sugar. A practiced cook flipped it in one motion, then slid poached eggs on top. The yolks broke over your hash like golden sauce. On the 20th Century Limited, the most prestigious train in America, a black cook served this to businessmen, politicians, and film stars every morning between New York and Chicago. He stood over that skillet where temperatures hit 125 degrees before sunrise. He got the crust right every time because the Pullman company fired cooks who served imperfect plates. No second chance, no grace period. You performed or you were replaced. These men stayed for decades because the railroad was one of the few places where a black man could earn a steady wage. That hash was not just breakfast. It was the price of stability in a country that offered black men very few places to stand. Number 13, lamb chops with mint sauce. This was the dinner that proved Pullman dining cars were not roadside diners. They were fine restaurants on wheels. A black cook seasoned the chops with salt and pepper, broiled them until the fat rendered and the edges crisped, then served them on heated plates with a bright green mint sauce made from fresh herbs, vinegar, and sugar. On the Milwaukee Road's Hiawatha line, lamb chops sold for 65 cents in 1935. That was a full day's food budget for many Americans during the Depression. The men who cooked your lamb could not afford to eat it. A Pullman cook's wage was barely enough to feed his own family. He spent his days preparing food he could not buy on a salary he could not live on. And still the lamb came out pink in the center. Still the mint sauce tasted fresh. Still the plate arrived as if the cook's own hunger did not exist. The gap between what these men produced and what they received was the quiet injustice at the heart of every railroad meal. Number 12, rice pudding with vanilla sauce. Slow-cooked rice stirred into sweetened custard of milk, eggs, sugar, and a scrape of vanilla bean, baked low until the top browned and the inside set creamy and trembling. Served warm with vanilla sauce poured over it like a thin golden river. On the Santa Fe line, this was the dessert passengers ordered when they wanted comfort. Not spectacle, not presentation, just something warm and good. The cook who made it understood that craving the way a preacher understands silence. He knew rice pudding belonged to people who had nothing but rice, sugar, and patience. The recipe moved from the kitchens of enslaved families to Pullman galley kitchens in one generation. The vanilla sauce was the only luxury. The rest was survival dressed up and served on your china. Number 11, pepper pot soup. Philadelphia claimed this soup, but black cooks perfected it on the rails. Tripe cut small, simmered for hours with potatoes, onion, celery, and heavy black pepper until the broth turned rich and the tripe turned tender. On the Pennsylvania Railroad, this was a winter standard. Black cooks knew tripe the way most cooks know chicken. They knew how to clean it, how to cut it, how to simmer it long enough to make it soft without letting it go to rubber. Tripe was awful, the cheapest cut at the butcher's counter. White cooks in fine hotels would not touch it, but black cooks had been transforming offal into food for centuries. Chitlins, hog maw, pig feet, tripe, these were the parts that enslavers threw away and enslaved people turned into cuisine. Pepper pot soup on a Pullman dining car was the direct descendant of that tradition. A cook turned what nobody wanted into what everybody ordered. That was more than cooking. That was a kind of quiet defiance, served hot, traveling at 60 miles an hour. If you ever tasted it, you understood something about survival that no history book could teach you. Number 10, planked whitefish. On railroads running through the Great Lakes, Fresh whitefish was loaded at station stops in Michigan and Wisconsin. A black cook seasoned the fillet with butter and lemon, mounted it on a hardwood plank, surrounded it with piped mashed potatoes, and broiled it until the fish flaked and the potato tips browned. The presentation was dramatic, like a still life painting served on wood. Piping potatoes with a pastry bag on a moving train took steady hands that most cooks develop over years in a professional kitchen. These men developed theirs on swaying rail cars with no formal instruction. The Milwaukee Road featured planked whitefish on its dinner menu. Black cooks turned a regional lake fish into a dish that rivaled anything you could order at the Palmer House in Chicago. They did it nightly, without recognition, without credit, without the title of chef that their skills deserved. The menu said planked whitefish. It should have said something about the man who made it. Number 9, lobster Newburg on toast points. Lobster meat folded into a rich sauce of butter, cream, egg yolks, and sherry, spooned over triangles of buttered toast. George Pullman named his first dining car the Delmonico in 1868 after the famous New York restaurant, and the menu drew from that fine kitchen. Black cooks were trained to replicate those recipes with a watchmaker's precision. Lobster Newburg required timing you could not fake. The sauce had to coat the lobster, but still porous. The yolks had to be tempered carefully or they would scramble. The sherry had to go in at the right moment or the sauce would break. A black cook performed this nightly in an 8-foot kitchen that shook with every rail joint. No culinary school behind him, just observation, repetition, and the knowledge that failure meant losing your livelihood. He got it right, night after night, year after year. That consistency was not luck. That was greatness wearing an apron. Number 8, biscuits and sausage gravy. Before dawn on the Illinois Central, while passengers slept, a black cook whose name nobody recorded was already working. He mixed flour, lard, and buttermilk into dough by hand. He cut biscuits with a tin can and slid the tray into the oven. While they baked, he browned pork sausage, crumbled it, stirred in flour and milk for a thick peppery gravy that smelled like every farmhouse kitchen in the Deep South. When the biscuits came out split and steaming, he ladled that gravy over them and sent the plates out. Every element came from the rural black kitchen. The technique of cutting biscuits with whatever was round and handy. The gravy from drippings, because you never waste rendered fat. On the railroad, this was listed at 35 cents. In the homes where it was born, it was worth the memory of every morning your grandmother woke before you did to make sure you started the day fed. Number 7, smothered pork chops with onion gravy. This was the meal that arrived at your table with a sound. The gravy still sizzling, the onions still whispering in the pan. A black cook on the Southern Railway seasoned bone-in chops, seared them hard, piled sliced onions on top, added broth, covered the pan, and braised everything until the onions collapsed into a silky gravy and the meat turned so tender it barely held the bone. This came from the black rural South. It was Saturday supper food, the meal a mother made when her children needed reminding that they were loved. On the train, it was served to passengers who had never set foot in a black home, never been invited to a black family's table. But for 30 minutes, they ate what a black family ate on its best night. The onion gravy soaked into the rice like butter into warm bread. The cook in the galley never saw the passengers eat. He only saw plates come back empty. That was his review. That was his standing ovation. In 1925, A. Philip Randolph founded the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the first black-led labor union in America. Those men organized because they understood the value of their work, even when the country refused to pay for it. The cooks organized alongside them. They knew that every plate of smothered pork chops was prepared by hands that deserved more than silence, more than $67 a month, more than a galley kitchen where the temperature never dropped below 100 degrees. That gravy carried more than flavor. It carried a movement. It carried the weight of men who refused to accept that their skill was worth less than the food it produced. Every onion those cooks sliced, every chop they seared, every plate they sent through the curtain was an act of labor and an act of resistance wrapped in the same motion. Number 6, chicken a la king. Diced chicken in cream sauce with pimientos, mushrooms, and green peppers, served in a pastry shell. This was French-inspired cooking adapted for American railroads, and black cooks produced it flawlessly. The sauce required building a roux, adding cream slowly, folding in vegetables without breaking them. On the 20th century, limited, this was a lunch standard. The black cook who made it had probably never eaten in a French restaurant because those restaurants did not serve black patrons in the 1920s. He learned to cook French food for people who would not eat beside him. He perfected a cuisine from a culture that excluded him. Your chicken a la king arrived on fine china. The cook ate his portion standing in the galley, if he ate at all. That distance between the dining car and the kitchen was more than 30 feet. It was the width of an entire country's hypocrisy. Number 5, shrimp Creole. On the Panama Limited between Chicago and New Orleans, this dish defined your journey. A black cook sauteed onions, celery, and green peppers, added tomatoes and spices, stirred engulfed shrimp, and simmered everything until the sauce thickened and the shrimp curled pink. Served over white rice. The recipe was pure Louisiana. The cook was probably from Louisiana himself, recruited because the railroad knew a black cook from the Gulf Coast could produce flavors no training manual could teach. Shrimp were loaded fresh at New Orleans. By Mississippi, the galley smelled like the French Quarter on a Saturday night. Passengers paid $1.25 in 1932. The cook earned $67 a month for 400 hours of work. He fed thousands of passengers food that carried his homeland in every bite. When you stepped off that train in New Orleans, you thought you had tasted Creole cooking for the first time. You did not realize you had been eating it since the dining car opened somewhere north of Memphis. Number 4, braised oxtail stew. This was awful cooking at its finest, and black cooks were the undisputed authorities. Oxtails browned in a heavy pot, then braised for hours with onions, carrots, celery, tomatoes, and red wine until the meat turned silky and the marrow dissolved into a gravy so rich it coated your tongue like velvet. On the Southern Pacific, this stew appeared as a winter special. Oxtails were cheap. Butchers practically gave them away. But in a Pullman cook's hands, those discarded bones became something magnificent. This was the legacy of enslaved cooking. Black cooks had spent generations transforming the cuts nobody else wanted into. Food everybody craved. Oxtails, neck bones, tripe, feet. These were the ingredients of survival, and survival had made these cooks the best in the country at slow braised, bone-deep flavor. Passengers called it delicious. They did not call it what it was. It was the cooking of a people turning nothing into something extraordinary. Number 3, cornbread pie. On the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, this dish became so famous that passengers reportedly rode past their stations for a second helping. A black cook layered seasoned ground meat with onions and spices in a baking dish, poured cornbread batter over the top, and baked it until the crust turned golden and the filling bubbled beneath like a pot of something sacred. Cornbread was the daily bread of the African American table, made from the cheapest grain in the country. No yeast, no rising time. You mixed it, you poured it, you baked it. The cook adapted a home recipe for a dining car, and the result crossed the line between humble and extraordinary. Passengers did not know they were eating a dish born from poverty. They just knew it was the best thing on the menu. That transformation from your grandmother's kitchen to first-class fare happened in the hands of a black cook who understood that the origin of a recipe does not determine its ceiling. Number 2, oyster pan roast. In the early 1900s, oysters were not luxury food. They were cheap and abundant along the eastern seaboard. Pullman cooks served them half a dozen ways, but the pan roast showed real skill. Fresh oysters heated quickly in butter with cream and Worcestershire until the edges curled and the liquor released into the sauce like the sea itself had entered the pan. Served immediately with toast points. The process took 3 minutes, and the margin for error was 0. Overcooked oysters turned to rubber. A black cook on the Pennsylvania Railroad judged the exact moment the edges curled and pulled the pan in, the same breath. He did this on a stove that shook, in a kitchen that barely fit 4 men. The skill was invisible to you. Your oyster arrived perfect. That was all you noticed, but behind that perfection stood a man whose reflexes were honed by years of cooking under conditions most chefs would refuse. The Pullman Company sold elegance. Black cooks produced it. Number 1, country ham with red-eye gravy and grits. This was the breakfast that opened the South and rode the rails all the way to Chicago. A thick slice of salt-cured country ham, fried until the edges caramelized and the fat rendered. Then a splash of black coffee poured into the hot drippings, stirred and scraped until the pan sauce turned a deep reddish brown. That was red-eye gravy, served alongside stone ground grits, cooked slow with butter and salt until creamy and thick. On the Southern Crescent, this breakfast was the first thing you smelled when you woke. A black cook had been up since 4 in the hot morning, stirring those grits over low heat because grits rushed with high flame turned to paste. He knew the ham had to crisp at the edges. He knew the coffee had to be strong and black. He knew all of this because his grandmother knew it, because her grandmother knew it. This recipe did not come from a Pullman training manual. It came from a lineage that stretched back through Reconstruction, through the first black hands that ever touched cast iron in this country. Country ham and red-eye gravy was the taste of the Black South, served on white china by black hands. The cook stood in a galley kitchen at 4 in the morning and made something perfect. And somewhere between the kitchen and the dining car lay the full distance of segregation. 30 feet of train car, a century of injustice, and a plate of food so good it almost made you forget.
Smothered breakfast potatoes were the skillet hero of 1960s mornings, a dish that stretched a handful of ingredients into something big enough to feed everyone. Mothers sliced the potatoes thin, letting them hit the hot grease before adding onions, peppers, salt, and a little black pepper for heat. The skillet hissed. The house filled with the scent of frying potatoes, and sleepy children wandered into the kitchen even before they were called. The potatoes softened and browned, edges crisping, onions turning sweet, and the peppers melting into the mix. This was a breakfast you could eat alone or beside eggs, biscuits, or sausage, and it never disappointed. Mothers loved it because it was dependable and cheap. Children loved it because it tasted like comfort, disguised as something simple. A plate of smothered potatoes could fuel a child until lunch, carrying them through long mornings at school or long walks down dusty roads. Over the years, frozen hash browns and faster options took its place, but nothing compares to the taste of potatoes cooked slow in a cast-iron skillet by a mother who knew exactly when to turn them. For those who remember, one spoonful brings back the sound of sizzling grease, and the warmth of a kitchen where breakfast meant love made visible. Fried cornbread patties made from hot water bread were the quick, crispy breakfast that came together in minutes, perfect for busy mothers who needed to feed many children before the day rushed in. Flour and cornmeal met boiling water until the mixture thickened into a dough that could be shaped right in the palm. The patties hit the skillet with a sizzle, frying in a thin layer of oil or bacon grease until the edges crisped and the centers stayed soft. Kids loved the sound as much as the taste. They begged for them with butter, with jelly, with a drizzle of cane syrup, or just plain hot from the skillet. These patties were the kind of food that taught children to appreciate texture. Crisp outside, tender inside, warm all the way through. Mothers made them without measuring because the recipe lived in their fingers, and every batch tasted slightly different depending on how much water or meal went in. Fried cornbread patties were fast, reliable, and comforting, the kind of breakfast that made sure no child walked out the door hungry. Even when grocery shelves brought new kinds of bread and packaged mixes, nothing matched the flavor of these simple patties eaten at the kitchen table while the morning light crept in. They tasted like survival, love, and tradition all pressed into a single handful. Today, many children have never seen them cooked, but those who remember can still taste that first bite. The warmth, the crunch, the feeling of being cared for before the day even started. Cream cheese and olive pinwheels, made with softened cream cheese mixed with chopped green olives and rolled in tortillas, created tangy, savory bites. Children found intriguing. Aunties would soften cream cheese and mix it with finely chopped green olives, pimentos, and sometimes a touch of garlic powder, spreading the mixture evenly on flour tortillas. The tortillas were rolled tightly, wrapped in plastic, and refrigerated for hours to firm up before being sliced into colorful pinwheels. Each slice revealed swirls of white cream cheese dotted with green olive pieces, creating visual appeal that drew children's attention. In 1970s, Black households, these pinwheels represented creative entertaining, showing how simple ingredients could become elegant appetizers. Children loved them because they were fun to look at, easy to eat, and introduced them to olives in a creamy format that made the vegetables more approachable and less intimidating than eating them whole. Smothered breakfast potatoes were the skillet hero of 1960s mornings, a dish that stretched a handful of ingredients into something big enough to feed everyone. Mothers sliced the potatoes thin, letting them hit the hot grease before adding onions, peppers, salt, and a little black pepper for heat. The skillet hissed, the house filled with the scent of frying potatoes, and sleepy children wandered into the kitchen even before they were called. The potatoes softened and browned, edges crisping, onions turning sweet, and the peppers melting into the mix. This was a breakfast you could eat alone or beside eggs, biscuits, or sausage, and it never disappointed. Mothers loved it because it was dependable and cheap. Children loved it because it tasted like comfort, disguised as something simple. A plate of smothered potatoes could fuel a child until lunch, carrying them through long mornings at school or long walks down dusty roads. Over the years, frozen hash browns and faster options took its place, but nothing compares to the taste of potatoes cooked slow in a cast-iron skillet by a mother who knew exactly when to turn them. For those who remember, one spoonful brings back the sound of sizzling grease and the warmth of a kitchen where breakfast meant love made visible. Cocktail meatballs simmered in grape jelly and chili sauce created sweet, savory bites that children couldn't resist, the glossy sauce coating each meatball like candy while delivering unexpected flavors. Mothers would brown frozen meatballs in skillets before transferring them to slow cookers or pots where they simmered in a mixture of grape jelly and bottled chili sauce that melted together into a thick, shiny glaze. The combination sounded strange but tasted magical, the grape jelly's sweetness balancing the chili sauce's tang and creating a flavor profile that kept people reaching for more. As the meatballs simmered, they absorbed the sauce and became tender, the exterior developing a sticky coating that made them perfect for spearing with toothpicks. In Black households during the 1970s, these cocktail meatballs represented easy elegance, a recipe that seemed fancy but required minimal effort. Children loved them because they were bite-sized, required no cutting, and tasted like a sweet, savory treat. Fluffy biscuits with syrup or jelly were the breakfast treat 1960s kids begged for with wide eyes and hopeful voices, knowing their mother could see straight through them but might give in anyway. These biscuits were not the kind that popped out of a can. They were soft, hand-mixed, cut by a jar or a tin cup, and baked until their tops turned the faintest shade of gold. When they came out of the oven, the whole kitchen smelled like butter and warmth, the kind of smell that made children hover around the stove waiting for permission to grab one. Mothers split them open with their fingers, steam curling into the air, then drizzled syrup or spread jelly inside until the biscuit soaked up every bit of sweetness. Sometimes the syrup ran down the sides, and kids licked it from their hands without hesitation. These biscuits felt like a weekend, even on a weekday, like a celebration even when money was too tight for fancy breakfasts. Mothers made them because they filled stomachs and stretched ingredients, but children loved them because they tasted like happiness before school. As frozen biscuits and fast mornings took over, these tender homemade biscuits started to disappear. But for the generation who grew up on them, one bite still carries the memory of a warm kitchen, a busy mother moving with practiced grace, and the pure joy of getting the first biscuit straight from the pan. Sausage patties made from scratch were the heartiest part of many 1960s black breakfasts, the kind of food that made a child feel ready to take on anything the school day threw at them. Mothers seasoned the meat by hand with salt, pepper, sage, and whatever spices their own mothers had taught them to use. They shaped the patties carefully and laid them in the skillet where they sizzled, browned, and filled the house with a smell that pulled children straight into the kitchen. These patties were crisp on the outside, juicy inside, and full of flavor you could not find in store-bought sausage. Kids sandwiched them in biscuits, crumbled them into grits, or ate them plain with their fingers when they were too hungry to wait for a fork. For mothers, making sausage from scratch was a way to stretch ingredients and control the flavor. For children, it was the taste of a real breakfast. As packaged sausage became easier to buy, homemade patties faded from daily life. But anyone who grew up eating them knows nothing beats the sound of sausage frying in a cast-iron skillet early in the morning. Homemade cane. Syrup drizzle once gave biscuits and pancakes a dark, smoky sweetness unmatched by refined sugar. Families would harvest sugarcane, crush the stalks, and boil the juice in large iron kettles until it thickened into a rich amber syrup. The work was hot and sticky, often stretching from dawn until late night, but the reward was a flavor that defined Southern breakfasts and holiday treats. Children watched the bubbling kettles with wide eyes, waiting for a chance to taste the warm syrup on a fresh biscuit. Neighbors often shared the labor and the finished product, turning the syrup-making into a community event as well as a culinary one. Over time, industrial sweeteners and store-bought syrups replaced the careful craft, and the knowledge of how to coax sweetness from cane faded with older generations. For those who remember, a spoonful of homemade cane syrup is more than a taste. It is a memory of family unity, hard work, and the sweetness that perseverance can bring. Fluffy biscuits with syrup or jelly were the breakfast treat 1960s kids begged for with wide eyes and hopeful voices, knowing their mother could see straight through them but might give in anyway. These biscuits were not the kind that popped out of a can. They were soft, hand-mixed, cut by a jar or a tin cup, and baked until their tops turned the faintest shade of gold. When they came out of the oven, the whole kitchen smelled like butter and warmth, the kind of smell that made children hover around the stove waiting for permission to grab one. Mothers split them open with their fingers, steam curling into the air, then drizzled syrup or spread jelly inside until the biscuit soaked up every bit of sweetness. Sometimes the syrup ran down the sides, and kids licked it from their hands without hesitation. These biscuits felt like a weekend, even on a weekday, like a celebration even when money was too tight for fancy breakfasts. Mothers made them because they filled stomachs and stretched ingredients, but children loved them because they tasted like happiness before school. As frozen biscuits and fast mornings took over, these tender homemade biscuits started to disappear. But for the generation who grew up on them, one bite still carries the memory of a warm kitchen, a busy mother moving with practiced grace, and the pure joy of getting the first biscuit straight from the pan.
Here is what you should carry with you. The Pullman Company employed more than 20,000 black workers at its peak. It was the largest employer of African Americans in the country. Those men carried more than luggage and plates. They carried newspapers from the North into the South. They carried word of jobs in Chicago and Detroit. They fueled the Great Migration. They built the brotherhood of sleeping car porters and laid the groundwork for the civil rights movement. The food they cooked was not just food, it was a record of what black hands could create under impossible conditions. Next time you sit down to eat something good, something someone made with care and knowledge and love, think about the men who did that in a kitchen 8 feet wide on a train at 60 miles an hour. Think about what they gave this country. Then think about what this country gave them back. Share which meal you would have ordered in the comments, because these were not just railroad meals. They were proof that the people who built this country's food could not be erased, not by segregation, not by silence, not by a menu that never once printed their